I had always believed that hard work and dedication would speak for themselves. After 20 years at Kingsview Construction, climbing from a construction worker to head of quality and safety management, I thought my position was secure. That belief shattered on a crisp October morning when Ryan Blake, our new vice president, called me into his corner office overlooking downtown Houston. "We value loyalty, but we need fresh energy," Ryan said, his words cutting through the morning silence like a blade. Those were my farewell words after 2 decades of dedication, as I was replaced by his inexperienced friend. I walked out of that office, but nobody knew that a routine inspection was coming, and it would reveal a truth no one expected. My name is Alex Thornton, and at 46, I had spent more than half my life ensuring that Kingsview Construction's projects met every safety standard, prevented legal violations, and maintained technical excellence. My father had been a construction engineer for 30 years before me, and he had taught me that safety and professional ethics weren't just job requirements. They were moral imperatives. Every beam, every wire, every foundation had to be perfect because people's lives depended on our work. The construction industry in Houston was booming in 2024, with new residential and commercial projects sprouting across the metropolitan area like concrete flowers after rain. Kingsview Construction had built its reputation over 4 decades as a company that delivered quality work on time and within budget. We weren't the cheapest option, but clients knew they could trust us to build structures that would stand for generations. My wife Julia, a structural engineer working for the city's permitting office, understood the pressures I faced better than anyone. She had seen too many projects fail because corners were cut, too many tragedies that could have been prevented with proper oversight. Our 16-year-old daughter, Emily, had grown up hearing dinner table conversations about load-bearing calculations and electrical codes, and she was already planning to study architecture in college. She understood that buildings weren't just structures. They were promises we made to the people who would live and work inside them. Ryan Blake had arrived at Kingsview 6 months earlier, transferred from a Dallas financial firm with impressive credentials in corporate restructuring but zero hands-on construction experience. He was 38. Sharp-dressed, and spoke in the kind of business jargon that impressed board members but meant nothing on a job site. From his first day, he had questioned our quality control procedures, particularly the costs associated with our rigorous inspection protocols. "Alex," he had said during our first one-on-one meeting, "I've been reviewing our quality assurance expenses, and they seem excessive compared to industry standards. Are we being too cautious?" I had explained that our standards weren't excessive. They were necessary. Every inspection, every verification, every double check served a purpose. We had built our reputation on delivering projects that passed every inspection on the first try. That never resulted in callbacks or safety issues. That never left us vulnerable to lawsuits or regulatory penalties. But Ryan saw numbers on spreadsheets, not the human cost of cutting corners. Over the following months, he had repeatedly asked me to consider using less expensive subcontractors, to reduce the frequency of safety inspections, to streamline our approval processes. Each time, I had politely but firmly declined, explaining why these measures would compromise our standards and potentially put people at risk. The tension had come to a head 3 weeks before my termination, when Ryan had pressured me to approve Hillcrest Electric as a subcontractor for our new luxury apartment complex, Lakeview Terrace. I had researched the company and discovered they had been cited multiple times for safety violations and had even had their license temporarily suspended 2 years earlier. When I refused to approve them, Ryan had been visibly frustrated. "Sometimes I wonder if you're more interested in protecting your department's authority than in helping this company grow," he had said, his voice carrying an edge I hadn't heard before. I had remained professional, but I knew something had shifted in our relationship. Ryan wasn't just questioning my judgment, he was questioning my loyalty to the company. In his mind, being loyal meant being flexible with standards, being willing to take calculated risks to improve profitability. In my mind, loyalty meant protecting the company from the kind of catastrophic failures that could destroy our reputation and put lives at risk. The morning of my termination, Ryan had called a department meeting that I thought was routine. Mason Cole, Ryan's friend from Dallas, was there supposedly for training and orientation purposes. Mason was 35, with an MBA in business administration and a confident smile that had never been tested by the reality of a construction crisis. He had been hanging around our offices for 2 weeks, shadowing various department heads and asking questions that revealed his complete lack of industry knowledge. "I want to talk about our department's future direction." Ryan had begun, his tone formal and final. "Kingsview is entering a new phase of growth, and we need leadership that can adapt to changing market conditions. Alex, your experience has been invaluable, but we've decided to move in a different direction. Mason will be taking over your responsibilities, effective immediately." The room had gone silent. My deputy manager, Sarah Chen, had looked shocked. Our senior inspector, Marcus Williams, had stared at the table. These people had worked with me for years, had learned the intricacies of construction safety under my guidance, had trusted my judgment in countless critical situations. Now they were being told that someone with no construction experience would be making decisions that could affect not just their jobs, but the safety of everyone who would eventually live or work in our buildings. I had kept my composure, asking only, "When is my last day?" "Today," Ryan had replied, "we'll have your final paperwork ready by this afternoon." As I cleaned out my office, 20 years of memories packed into cardboard boxes, I thought about all the disasters I had prevented, all the problems I had caught before they became crises, the time I had identified faulty concrete that could have caused a parking garage to collapse, the electrical inspection that had revealed wiring problems that could have resulted in fires, the structural analysis that had prevented a high-rise balcony from becoming a death trap. Mason had stopped by as I was finishing, offering what he probably thought was a reassuring smile. "Don't worry about anything. Alex, I've got everything under control. Sometimes fresh eyes can see opportunities that experience might miss." I had nodded politely, but inwardly I was terrified. Fresh eyes without knowledge were dangerous in construction. This wasn't an industry where you learned by making mistakes. Mistakes in construction could kill people. That evening, I had sat with Julia and Emily at our kitchen table, explaining what had happened. Julia had been angry, both at the injustice of my situation and at the potential consequences for public safety. Emily had been confused about why someone would replace experience with inexperience, why a company would value friendship over competence. "What happens now, Dad?" Emily had asked. "I don't know," I had admitted, "but I know I can't just walk away and pretend everything will be fine." Over the next 2 weeks, I had tried to let go, to trust that somehow Mason would seek advice when he needed it, that the other experienced members of my former team would guide him through the complex world of construction safety. But then Julia had come home from work with disturbing news. "I processed some permit modifications for Kingsview today," she had said, her expression troubled. "The electrical subcontractor approval had your signature on it, but the work was submitted after you were terminated. Alex, they're using Hillcrest Electric, and the paperwork shows your approval from last week. My signature had been forged. Someone had falsified documents to approve the very subcontractor I had refused to work with, the one with the suspended license and multiple safety violations. This wasn't just about my job anymore. This was about preventing a potential disaster." I had called my former deputy, Sarah Chen, that evening. "Sarah, I need you to tell me honestly, what's happening with the Lakeview Terrace project?" Sarah's voice had been strained, almost whispered. "Alex, I wanted to call you, but Mason said we weren't supposed to discuss ongoing projects with former employees. It's chaos here. He's approved contractors we've never worked with. He's waived inspections to speed up the schedule. And when we try to explain why certain protocols exist, he says we're being resistant to change." "What about the electrical work?" "Hillcrest Electric started work yesterday. Marcus tried to inspect their preliminary installations, but Mason told him it wasn't necessary, that the contractors are licensed professionals and we need to trust their expertise." I had felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. Hillcrest Electric working without proper oversight on a residential project where families would eventually live. The potential for tragedy was enormous. That night, I had made the hardest decision of my professional life. I contacted the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulations Construction Compliance Division and filed a formal complaint about potential safety violations at the Lakeview Terrace project. I provided documentation about Hillcrest Electric's history, copies of the forged approval documents, and a detailed explanation of the oversight failures that had occurred since my departure. The response had been swift. Vanessa Edwards, a senior inspector with the state's Construction Oversight Division, had called me within 48 hours. Mr. Thornton, we take these allegations very seriously, she had said. We're scheduling an immediate surprise inspection of the Lakeview Terrace project. Given your experience and the specificity of your complaint, we'd like you to be available as a consulting witness if needed. 3 days later, I had been working in my home office, updating my resume and researching other construction companies, when my phone rang. It was Sarah Chen, and she was almost whispering. Alex, there are state inspectors here, 3 of them, with official badges and clipboards. Mason is panicking, and Ryan just arrived looking like he's seen a ghost. They're asking for documentation on all our electrical approvals, and they want to know who authorized the Hillcrest Electric contract. I had felt no satisfaction, only a deep sadness that it had come to this. Are they inspecting the actual work, or just the paperwork? Both. They've got electrical testing equipment, and they're going through every connection Hillcrest has made. Alex, they've already found problems, serious problems. The inspection had lasted 2 full days. Vanessa Edwards and her team had discovered violations so severe that they had immediately issued stop work orders for 3 of the apartment buildings in the complex. The electrical installations failed to meet current safety codes, with improper grounding that could have resulted in electrocution hazards. Fire safety systems had been incorrectly installed, creating potential fire traps instead of escape routes. Even basic structural connections had been compromised by substandard work from contractors Mason had approved without proper vetting. The findings had been devastating. Building permits were suspended pending complete remediation. The state had imposed fines totaling nearly $500,000. Most seriously, criminal charges were being considered for the document forgery, as falsifying construction safety approvals was a felony under Texas law. Mason had been immediately suspended, and Ryan had been called before Kingsview's board of directors to explain how a project under his oversight had resulted in such catastrophic compliance failures. The board's investigation had revealed the full scope of the problems: unauthorized contractor approvals, waived safety inspections, forged documents, and a complete breakdown of the quality control systems that had protected the company for 4 decades. Within a week, Ryan had been terminated. Mason had quietly resigned and left Houston, reportedly taking a job selling residential real estate in a small town outside Dallas. The Lakeview Terrace project was in limbo, with massive remediation costs and potential lawsuits from investors who had committed to purchasing units and buildings that might never be completed. But the story wasn't over. The Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation had a problem. They needed someone with extensive knowledge of Kingsview's projects and procedures to oversee the remediation work and ensure that the company's other ongoing projects met safety standards. They needed someone with an impeccable reputation for integrity and a deep understanding of construction safety protocols. Vanessa Edwards had called me on a Thursday morning in November. Mr. Thornton, the state is requiring Kingsview to hire an independent safety oversight consultant to supervise their remediation efforts and audit their other active projects. Given your background and your role in bringing these violations to light, we'd like to recommend you for this position. The offer had been extraordinary. Not only would I return to overseeing construction safety, but I would have authority over all of Kingsview's projects, with the backing of state regulatory authority. The position came with a significant salary increase and the kind of independence I had never had as a company employee. Kingsview's interim management had contacted me that afternoon. The board of directors, faced with the choice between hiring me as mandated by the state or losing their operating license, had made the obvious decision. They had offered me the position of Senior Quality Management Director for the entire Southwest region, with oversight of all projects in Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. My first day back at Kingsview had been surreal. I had walked into the same building where I had been terminated 6 weeks earlier, but now I occupied the corner office that had previously belonged to Ryan Blake. The nameplate on my door read, Alexander Thornton, Regional Director, Quality Assurance and Safety Compliance. Sarah Chen had knocked on my door that morning, carrying a stack of project files. "Alex, I can't tell you how good it feels to have you back. We've been drowning without proper oversight. We're going to rebuild this department the right way." I had told her, every project, every contractor, every inspection, we're going back to the standards that made this company reliable. The remediation of Lakeview Terrace had taken 4 months. Every electrical installation had to be torn out and rebuilt to code. Fire safety systems were completely redesigned and reinstalled. Structural work that had been compromised by unqualified contractors was reinforced or replaced. The cost had ultimately exceeded $700,000, but the buildings that emerged from the process were safer than they had ever been intended to be. Marcus Williams, my former senior inspector, had become my deputy director. Together, we had implemented new protocols that went beyond even our previous standards. Every contractor approval now required verification of licenses, insurance, and safety records. Every inspection was documented with digital photography and electronic signatures that couldn't be forged. Every project had multiple checkpoints where work couldn't proceed without verified safety compliance. But perhaps the most important change was cultural. The near disaster at Lakeview Terrace had reminded everyone at Kingsview why construction safety wasn't optional, why experienced oversight mattered, why cutting corners in pursuit of short-term profits could result in long-term catastrophe. The company's new leadership, brought in after Ryan's termination, understood that our reputation for quality and safety was our most valuable asset. 6 months after returning to work, I had been promoted again, this time to Vice President of Operations for Quality and Safety, overseeing not just construction projects, but also the company's safety training programs and regulatory compliance efforts. It was the position I had always dreamed of having, with the authority to implement industry-leading safety standards across all of Kingsview's operations. One evening, in late spring, I had driven Emily to visit the completed Lakeview Terrace complex. The building stood solid and safe, their windows glowing warmly in the evening light. Families were moving in. Children were playing in the courtyard. Elderly residents were enjoying the accessible design features we had insisted on during the remediation. "It's hard to believe these buildings were almost dangerous," Emily had said, looking up at the apartments where dozens of families were beginning new chapters of their lives. "That's the thing about construction," I had replied. "When we do our jobs right, nobody ever knows about the disasters we prevented, the tragedies we stopped before they could happen. Success in this business is measured by all the things that don't go wrong." Emily had nodded thoughtfully. At 17 now, she was finalizing her college applications, still planning to study architecture with a focus on sustainable design. "I want to build things that make people's lives better," she had said, "but I also want to make sure they're safe. That's the most important thing." I had told her, "Beauty and functionality don't mean anything if people can't trust the buildings they live and work in." As we drove home through Houston's sprawling neighborhoods, past construction sites where yellow cranes reached toward the sky like mechanical prayers, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this point. Being fired had felt like the end of my career, but it had actually been the beginning of something better. The betrayal that had seemed so devastating had ultimately revealed the true value of experience, integrity, and professional ethics. Ryan Blake and Mason Cole had believed that construction was just another business where relationships and cost-cutting could overcome the need for expertise. They had learned, at considerable expense, that some industries require genuine knowledge and that some mistakes can't be undone with good intentions or clever explanations. Julia had been right when she told me, during those dark weeks after my termination, that sometimes the worst things that happen to us turn out to be redirections toward something better. I had been forced out of a comfortable position where I had limited authority and constant friction over safety standards. I had been pushed into a role where I had the power to implement the kind of comprehensive safety culture I had always believed the industry needed. My salary had nearly doubled, but more importantly, my influence had expanded beyond anything I had previously imagined. I was now consulted by other construction companies seeking to improve their safety protocols. State regulators asked for my input on new building codes. Industry publications interviewed me about best practices in construction oversight. But the real satisfaction came from simpler things. walking through project sites and seeing workers who took safety seriously because they knew their work was being properly supervised, reviewing inspection reports that showed consistent compliance with all safety standards, meeting families who were moving into apartments or homes that I knew had been built to the highest standards of quality and safety. Sarah Chen had been promoted to regional safety manager, overseeing inspection teams across 3 states. Marcus Williams had become a sought-after consultant, helping other companies develop the kind of comprehensive safety protocols we had implemented at Kingsview. Even some of the construction workers who had been employed by the substandard contractors we had eliminated had found better jobs with companies that valued their skills and prioritized their safety. The industry had taken notice of what we had accomplished. Construction Trade Weekly had featured our safety program in a cover story titled "How One Company Turned Crisis into Industry Leadership." The Texas Construction Safety Council had given me their annual award for contributions to worker safety. Most meaningfully, we hadn't had a single serious safety incident on any project under my oversight in more than 18 months. On a warm evening in late summer, almost exactly 2 years after my termination, I had been working late in my office when Vanessa Edwards had called. "Alex, I wanted to let you know that the state is considering implementing some of your safety protocols as minimum standards for all construction projects over a certain size. Your work at Kingsview has become a model for the kind of oversight we'd like to see industry-wide." The conversation had lasted nearly an hour, discussing the technical details of scaling our safety protocols and the potential impact on construction quality across the state. After hanging up, I had sat quietly in my office, looking out at the Houston skyline where lights were beginning to twinkle in dozens of buildings that had been constructed under proper safety oversight. Emily had called just as I was preparing to leave the office. She was now a freshman at Rice University, studying architectural engineering with a specialization in sustainable construction practices. Her professors had been impressed by her understanding of construction safety principles, knowledge she had gained from years of dinner table conversations about the intersection of design and safety. "Dad, I wanted to tell you about a project we're working on in my design studio," she had said, her voice excited. "We're designing affordable housing that meets the highest safety standards while keeping costs reasonable. My professor says it's exactly the kind of thinking the industry needs." "That sounds like important work," I had told her. "Safe, affordable housing is one of the biggest challenges in construction today. I keep thinking about what you told me about the Lakeview Terrace project." She had continued, "How cutting corners to save money ended up costing so much more in the long run. I want to prove that you can build safely and affordably if you plan correctly from the beginning." Driving home that evening, I had reflected on how profoundly my life had changed since that October morning when Ryan Blake had told me the company needed fresh energy. The betrayal that had seemed so devastating had ultimately led to the most fulfilling period of my career. The friend with no qualifications who had replaced me had inadvertently created the crisis that revealed the true value of experience and integrity. Julia had been waiting for me with dinner and a bottle of wine we had been saving for a special occasion. "What are we celebrating?" I had asked. 2 years, she had said. 2 years since you came home devastated and convinced your career was over. Look where you are now." We had talked late into the evening about the unexpected paths that life sometimes takes, how setbacks can become setups for greater success, how sometimes the worst betrayals reveal the strength of character we didn't know we possessed. Julia had seen the transformation not just in my career, but in my confidence and sense of purpose. "You were always good at your job," she had told me, "but you're better now. Having to fight for what you believe in, having to prove your worth all over again, it made you stronger." The following week, I had received a call that brought the story full circle. Mason Cole had contacted me, his voice hesitant and apologetic. "Alex, I know I have no right to ask this, but I'm hoping you might be willing to give me some advice. I've been trying to get back into construction, but my reputation, well, you know what happened. I've realized I made a terrible mistake thinking I could step into your role without understanding what it really involved." We had met for coffee at a downtown Houston cafe, and Mason had looked older, humbler, chastened by his experience. He had spent the past 2 years selling real estate, but he had never stopped thinking about construction. He had taken evening classes in construction management, had studied building codes on his own time, had tried to understand the industry he had so disastrously misunderstood. "I'm not asking for a job," he had said. "I know I'll never work for Kingsview again, and I know I have to rebuild my reputation from the ground up. But I was hoping you might be willing to help me understand how to do this right." I had agreed to mentor him, not out of forgiveness for what he had done, but out of recognition that the industry benefited when people truly understood the importance of safety and quality. Mason had become one of the most dedicated students I had ever worked with, spending weekends on construction sites as an unpaid observer, studying every aspect of project management and safety oversight. A year later, he had found a position as a junior project coordinator with a small residential construction company, starting at the bottom and earning his way up through demonstrated competence rather than personal connections. He had called me after his first successful project completion, his voice filled with genuine pride and gratitude. "Alex, I finally understand what you tried to tell Ryan all those times. This isn't just about buildings, it's about trust. When people move into a home or work in an office, they're trusting us with their lives. I never really understood that before." Ryan Blake. I had learned through industry contacts, had left construction entirely and returned to finance, working for a mid-sized investment firm in Dallas. The failure at Kingsview had followed him, making it difficult to find positions with the kind of authority he had previously enjoyed. He had never reached out to me, never acknowledged his role in the crisis that had nearly destroyed both our careers. But I bore him no ill will. Ryan had made decisions based on his understanding of business, not realizing that construction was different from other industries, that some risks couldn't be managed through financial strategies alone. His failure had been one of ignorance rather than malice, and the consequences had taught lessons that would benefit the industry for years to come. On the third anniversary of my termination, I had been invited to speak at the annual Texas Construction Safety Conference. My presentation, titled "When Standards Matter More Than Relationships, Lessons from a Crisis," had drawn the largest audience in the conference's history. I had told the story of Lakeview Terrace not as a tale of personal vindication, but as a case study in why construction safety couldn't be compromised for any reason. The moment we decide that relationships are more important than qualifications, that cost savings matter more than safety standards, that speed matters more than quality, we put lives at risk. I had told the audience of construction professionals, our industry exists to create safe, functional spaces where people can live and work and dream. Everything else is secondary to that fundamental responsibility. The presentation had been recorded and had become required viewing for construction management students at several Texas universities. Emily had watched it online and had called me afterward, her voice filled with pride. "Dad, I finally understand why you were so upset when you were fired, and why you couldn't just let things go when you saw what was happening. You weren't just protecting your job, you were protecting people who would never even know you existed. That's what this work is really about." I had told her, "The families who sleep safely in buildings we've inspected, the workers who go home healthy because we enforce safety protocols, the communities that thrive in structures built to last, they're the real measure of our success." Now, 5 years after that devastating October morning, I sat in my office as Senior Vice President of Safety and Quality Assurance for Kingsview Construction's entire South Central region. My authority extended over projects in 6 states, with a team of more than 50 safety professionals reporting to me. We had achieved industry-leading safety records, with 0 serious incidents in more than 3 years. The Lakeview Terrace complex had become one of Houston's most desirable residential communities, its reputation for quality and safety making it a model for other developments. Property values had exceeded initial projections, proving that building to the highest standards was not just ethically right, but economically smart. Sarah Chen had been promoted to Assistant Vice President, overseeing safety training programs that other companies were now licensing from us. Marcus Williams had started his own consulting firm, specializing in helping construction companies develop comprehensive safety cultures. Both had credited our experience during the crisis with teaching them lessons they couldn't have learned any other way. Emily was now a senior at Rice University, preparing for graduate school with a focus on sustainable construction technologies. Her senior thesis project was designing safety-integrated affordable housing systems that could be replicated across different markets. She had internships lined up with two of the industry's most respected firms, both of which had contacted me to say they were impressed by her combination of technical knowledge and ethical grounding. Julia had been promoted to senior structural engineer for the city of Houston, overseeing permit approvals for major commercial projects. Our shared understanding of construction safety had made us better partners both at work and at home, and she often consulted with me on projects that required coordination between city oversight and private construction management. The industry itself had changed in ways that I never could have anticipated. The Lakeview Terrace crisis had become a case study taught in construction management programs across the country. State regulators had implemented new requirements for safety oversight based largely on protocols we had developed. Insurance companies were offering premium discounts to construction companies that could demonstrate comprehensive safety management systems. But perhaps the most satisfying change was cultural. The new generation of construction professionals understood that safety and quality were not obstacles to profit, but foundations for sustainable success. They had grown up hearing stories about companies that had failed because they cut corners, about careers that had been destroyed by prioritizing relationships over competence, about communities that had suffered because construction professionals forgot their fundamental responsibility to protect public safety. On a recent evening, I had driven past the Lakeview Terrace complex with Emily, who was home for spring break. The building stood solid and beautiful in the fading light, their windows glowing with the warmth of families and lives being lived safely within walls built to the highest standards. "It's hard to believe this place was almost a disaster," Emily had said, looking up at the apartments where children were playing on balconies that had been rebuilt to exceed safety codes. "That's the beauty of doing this work right," I had replied. "When we succeed, nobody knows about the catastrophes we prevented, the lives we protected, the tragedies we stopped before they could happen. Our success is invisible, but it matters more than anything else we could possibly do." As we drove home through Houston's sprawling neighborhoods, past construction sites where new buildings were rising under proper oversight, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The betrayal that had seemed so devastating had become the catalyst for the most meaningful work of my life. The injustice that had felt so crushing had revealed strengths and possibilities I had never imagined. Ryan Blake and Mason Cole had unknowingly given me the greatest gift of my career, the opportunity to prove that experience matters, that integrity has value, that some things are more important than relationships or cost savings or career advancement. They had forced me out of a comfortable but limited role and pushed me into a position where I could make a real difference in an industry I loved. The lesson I had learned, and the one I now shared with every young professional who asked for advice, was that setbacks often set us up for something better. Being replaced by an unqualified friend had hurt my pride and threatened my security, but it had also freed me from constraints I hadn't even realized existed. The crisis that had seemed like an ending had actually been a beginning. In the construction industry, we talk a lot about foundations, the concrete and steel structures that support everything built above them. But I had learned that the most important foundations are invisible, the principles and standards and ethical commitments that support not just individual careers, but entire industries. When those foundations are solid, everything else can be built safely. When they are compromised, even the most impressive structures can collapse. 5 years after walking out of that office in defeat, I had built a career on those invisible foundations. The betrayal had revealed their strength, the crisis had tested their durability, and the recovery had proved their value. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the best thing that could have happened. Not because the pain wasn't real, but because it forces you to discover what you're really capable of achieving. The inspectors who had arrived to investigate our violations had found more than just safety problems and forged documents. They had found a man whose commitment to doing the right thing was stronger than his fear of career consequences, stronger than his comfort with the status quo, stronger than his desire to avoid conflict with people who had power over his professional future. That discovery had changed everything, not just for me, but for an entire industry that needed to be reminded why standards exist, why experience matters, why some things cannot be compromised no matter how convenient it might be to look the other way. The fresh energy that Ryan Blake had thought he was bringing to the company had nearly destroyed it. The experienced oversight he had dismissed as outdated had ultimately saved it. As I sat in my office on that anniversary evening, looking out at a city full of buildings that stood safe and strong because people like me had insisted on doing things the right way, I felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the career success that had followed my darkest professional moment, but for the reminder that integrity has its own rewards, that competence eventually reveals itself, and that sometimes the people who try to replace you end up proving why you were irreplaceable in the first place. The phone on my desk rang, and I saw Emily's number on the caller ID. She was calling from her dorm room at Rice, probably taking a break from studying for finals. "Dad, I just wanted to tell you that I got the internship with Morrison Construction for this summer. They said they were particularly impressed by my understanding of safety protocols and ethical construction practices." "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Morrison is one of the best firms in the Southwest. The interviewer told me something interesting." Emily continued. "He said they've been following the changes at Kingsview over the past few years, and they consider your safety program to be the gold standard for the industry. He asked if you would be willing to consult with them on developing similar protocols for their projects." I smiled, thinking about how far we had all come from that October morning when Ryan Blake had decided the company needed fresh energy instead of experienced leadership. "Tell them I'd be happy to discuss it. There's always room for improvement in construction safety." After hanging up, I gathered my things and prepared to head home to Julia, who would be waiting with dinner and stories about her own day managing construction permits for the city. As I turned off the lights in my office, I took one last look at the framed photo on my desk, the Lakeview Terrace complex as it looked today. Safe and beautiful and filled with families who would never know how close they had come to living in buildings that could have been death traps. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new projects to oversee, new safety standards to implement, new professionals to train in the principles that had guided my entire career. But tonight, I would go home to my family, satisfied in the knowledge that sometimes the worst betrayals lead to the best outcomes. Sometimes being replaced by an unqualified friend results in opportunities you never could have imagined. And sometimes the inspectors who arrive to investigate violations end up discovering the true value of the person who tried to prevent them in the first place. The drive home took me past 3 major construction projects that were being built under safety protocols I had helped develop, in a city that was growing stronger and safer because people like me had refused to compromise on the standards that protected public welfare. It was exactly the kind of evening my father would have been proud of, the kind of legacy I hoped to leave for Emily, the kind of work that made every challenge and setback worthwhile. Ryan Blake had been wrong about many things, but he had been right about one. Companies do need energy. They need the energy that comes from people who care more about doing things right than about taking shortcuts, more about protecting others than about protecting themselves, more about building something that will last than about building something quickly. That was the kind of fresh energy that had ultimately transformed Kingsview Construction from a company in crisis to an industry leader, and it was the kind of energy that would keep making a difference long after the people who had tried to compromise our standards were forgotten.